My name is Buffy, and today we are doing a Grace and Gavel two-part live. The most disturbing abandoned car cases feel frozen in time. And part 2 is why abandoned vehicle cases become psychological obsessions. So if you are a true crime junkie, you likely have cases that you're still fixated on, likely because they've not been resolved, or because there's some mysterious element that doesn't make sense, which could potentially prevent it from actually being resolved and taken care of. So let's go into part 1. Welcome. My name's Buffy. Nice to meet you. Today we're doing a two-part live. We are doing the most disturbing abandoned car cases feel frozen in time and why abandoned vehicle cases become psychological obsessions. So if you are a person who is a true crime junkie, who is obsessed with certain cases based on the fact of the facts don't add up, things don't seem to make sense, and everything is kind of suspended because you're still waiting for the resolution. That case for me has been Jennifer Kesse because I remember it from the very beginning. And so let's talk about the car was found, but the driver was gone. There is something deeply unsettling about finding a vehicle exactly where it shouldn't be, with no clear explanation to where the person went, which is extremely difficult because humans by nature do not like unfinished loops. They like to have things that are resolved in a nice, neat little bow, right? And so ultimately, there is a psychological impact of abandoned vehicle cases because the vehicle itself symbolizes freedom. It symbolizes going to work, from work, going home, making vacation plans with your family. All these things, the car is supposed to be the safety, the travel, the adventure, right? People don't expect people to be separated from their vehicle, right? And so ultimately, cars symbolize ordinary life. All of us, or most of us, have vehicles, or we have friends who have vehicles. So we are used to traveling by vehicle. And when the vehicle remains, but the person is gone, it unsettles us. It makes us think that this happened on an ordinary Monday or an ordinary Tuesday. What could potentially happen to us, right? And I also want to introduce a newer case. I have not covered this one yet. We're going to talk today about Brandon Swanson. Brandon Swanson is another abandoned car case. He disappeared in Minnesota in 2008 after driving into a ditch. He called his parents for help, and he remained on the phone while he was walking. He suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit." The phone disconnected, and he was never seen again. So this case is rife with a lot of mystery. Given the fact that he had called his parents for help, he knew that he needed some help. And he had his phone with him as he's walking. But somehow the phone disconnected and Brandon Swanson was never seen again. So the question becomes, what happened to Brandon Swanson? Was it environmental danger? Did he essentially walk into a body of water? Did he freeze? Did he succumb to the elements? Was he disoriented? Maybe he, essentially had the darkness and the rural terrain, especially Minnesota. You think about Minnesota, it would likely be easier to potentially get some sort of hypothermia or whatever, given the fact that Minnesota tends to be pretty cold. It's probably one of the coldest states in the Midwest, especially during that time. And him driving into a ditch. So with it being dark and rural terrain, not very many people around, unless maybe there was someone there at that point. And also the search was complicated based on the conditions. And the sudden silence haunts people because he was on the phone, he was talking to his parents until he wasn't. What happened after that? And so the final moments are often ordinary until suddenly they're not. And this is what this case was. This was an ordinary day where he's contacting his family, communicating with them, and then he says the comment that he made, and then the phone disconnected. Why did the phone disconnect? Did he lose signal? Did someone get the phone from him? Was there someone else out in the woods that he didn't realize in that rural environment? And so ultimately, sometimes mystery begins with a single interrupted sentence, and that is exactly what we have there. Now, part 2 is why abandoned vehicle cases become psychological obsessions. Cases involving abandoned cars often haunt people for decades because they feel emotionally unfinished. And they are emotionally unfinished because people want a closed loop. People want to know what happened to these people. These are human beings who have families, who were missed, who were loved. And ultimately, there's no resolution. And people do not like unresolved cases. Our brain hates unresolved cases, right? And so ultimately, with Brandon Swanson, we will definitely be going into a deeper analysis here at some point. And ultimately, Brandon Swanson's case is a little bit different, given the fact that he was in a colder environment, given the fact that he did have a ditch incident, which is very similar to Maura Murray. The other thing is he was in a rural environment. It was dark. Maybe he wasn't that familiar with where he was at. And then Patricia Meehan, she had also been involved in a car accident. I wouldn't necessarily call Brandon Swanson's a car accident, but, going into a ditch would be a situation that would be really frustrating. And so Patricia Meehan, if you remember, got into a head-on collision, and then with witness, which is very unusual, ended up just walking away and vanishing. And so that's very kind of concerning. And ultimately, people obsess over timelines. And timelines are important, but ultimately, you need to have the full picture of the timeline. A lot of people have pieces of the timeline, but not the entire timeline. And then the other thing is ambiguity. Ambiguity is so difficult to overcome because we don't have the full pieces of the puzzle. And so we can't necessarily put all that stuff together until we have the entire timeline. But the likelihood of having the entire timeline, especially when there are no witnesses and there's no people seeing it, can be extremely difficult. As well as hindsight bias. A lot of people feel like they know exactly what happened just from looking at the case. But clearly, unless they were there and unless they witnessed it, that's just a bias, right? Because there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of unknowns. A lot of things could have occurred. Maybe he was disoriented. Maybe he had been intoxicated. Again, any number of things could have occurred. Maybe he just was not used to the rural environment. I don't know if he was from there per se. And so ultimately, there's a lot of things kind of working against him. Maybe he was also frustrated and upset. And if he's anything like me and he froze, which is kind of what I tend to do when I get really stressed out, it can be really difficult to overcome. Again, there's a lot of internet theories, but ultimately people are just speculating at this point. And oftentimes there's a lot of emotional projection in true crime communities, right? Where they tend to project things on other people, whether or not they're true, and try to sensationalize certain things. And so these cases create long-term fixation because people are anxiously waiting for the family to be able to get closure, for us to get closure, for us to close the loop, for us to figure out what happened, because we do not like unsolved mysteries, even though Robert Stack was awesome, but we do not like unsolved mysteries, right? And so people replay these stories because the brain hates unresolved endings. Have you ever read a book and get to the last page and realize that some jerk ripped out the last page so you don't know how it ends? I have. And that's one of the most frustrating, annoying things. And you want to find that person and you want to be like, why are you such a jerk? Right? Similar to this, we're like, just help us solve this. Help us solve this. An abandoned car becomes a symbol of interrupted normalcy. And a lot of us are terrified of the thought of that. So in closing, maybe the reason these cases stay with us is because they remind us how fragile ordinary life really is. Thank you for tuning in to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. If you got value from this, please feel free to like and subscribe. I do post my replays on YouTube under Grace and Gavel or under Recovering Perfectionist Mama, depending on which podcast it is from. But if you get value from this, please feel free to like and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. I do publish daily on both of my lanes. Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress is a psychology channel, and then Grace and Gavel, Where Truth Meets Compassion, is a true crime channel. So we do topics like this, we deep dive into things, and I hope that you'll come back and see me again soon. I also go live on YouTube Live fairly regularly. So if you feel inclined, feel free to drop a time that would be convenient for you. And I would love to take a poll and try to get more of you involved in building our community. We have a fantastic community, empathetic, compassionate people who are true crime junkies as well as into psychology. So if you're into that, hey, we'd love to have you. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.